I never know how long to let this go, John. So stop me whenever.
I think that's good. I like it. Maybe we can get things going while it's still playing. I think that's a good strategy.
All right, let's get things going then. It's all on
Yeah.
you. What's up, John? How you doing?
I'm doing well, Tyler. How are you today?
Doing well. Nice to see you dressed up for the occasion.
Yeah, I thought, well, Super Bowl Sunday, we have a guest on. I'm going to put on my nice hoodie.
Nobody told you about our esteemed guest, Dr. John Dupey. Did I say that right?
You did not.
Oh no.
His name is
He's Oh no. Please introduce our guest because I obviously know nothing about anything.
Okay, so our guest today is Dr. James Dupey, who runs
John.
Yeah.
James, my apologies.
But James runs he runs the master's program in history at ASU. He's one of the only guy I've ever met who passed his dissertation without any revisions recommended. So he's big time. So we're very lucky to have him. And today we're going to dive more into the Second Great Awakening. So if you remember last week, we talked about sort of the beginnings of the Second Great Awakening and a little bit of how Joseph Smith may have experienced that. Today, we're going to do an even deeper dive into the context around Joseph Smith's visions, sort of what was going on around the country at the time. And yeah, it should be a good time. James is an expert in this, so it'll be good.
Awesome. Well, I will bring James on. I'm going to start off apologizing for calling him the wrong name. James, I am so sorry.
No, that's all right.
With that, let me put you on the big screen so everyone can see you. I'll let you guys get started. I just heard my popcorn stop popping, so I'm going to go grab that and hide a little bit until I gain the courage to actually talk with James again.
Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. So, James, let's start just a little bit about you. Could you tell us a little bit about your background, your resume, what your specialties are, all that good stuff?
Yeah. I loved the introduction. That was
you like that?
Yeah, that was good. I think I'm gonna start leading with that when I introduce myself. Yeah, that was a surprise for me as well. So that was great. I study religion and capitalism in the early Republic, and particularly I look at why different prescriptions for religious life were successful and others failed. And of course, Mormon history is a significant part of that story, though most of my research didn't look at Mormon history. The most that I've looked at Mormon history sort of professionally is I published an article on thinking about sacred space, and Joseph Smith and Alexander Campbell were the two leaders of the primary restoration movements in the Second Great Awakening. They had very different ideas about sacred space. Smiths were sort of conventional. He thought of sacred space in the way that sacred space has sort of been thought of in Christian history for a long time, with some caveats. Whereas Campbell sort of did something that I think is useful for scholars to do, which is to break down the sacred profane binary. Campbell saw all things as sacred and all things as profane. All things were material. And so what that meant for those spaces, it was really significant. And so my first article was thinking about the difference between these two restoration movements and how they thought about sacred space. But other than that, mostly what I focused on is thinking about capitalism and the role that capital played in the Second Great Awakening. And that's the research course I teach. That's the readings I teach to graduate students, as well as sort of the standard North American core and those sorts of courses. But yeah, so that's my expertise, I guess.
Awesome,
Cool.
thank you.
So James, one thing you'll learn about me, as I'm sure you've listened to every podcast episode so far, along with
Definitely
everyone else, is I know next to nothing. And so I'll ask questions. And so the first thing I don't know, I'm obviously familiar with Joseph Smith. Campbell, what church would he have started that I might be familiar with?
Yeah, so today there are three groups that come from Campbell. The Disciples of Christ, the Churches of Christ, which is somewhat interesting, right? Because that was Smith's first name for what became the Mormon Church, and then the LDS Church, and so on and so forth. And then the Christian Church. So in 1906, there's an official split, but the split really exists before that. And in 1906, the Disciples of Christ are effectively the northern branch of the Campbellite group. And Campbellite is a derogatory term, but I use it because it's the most effective way for grouping these people together. So they wanted to be called Christians, but that's not a very useful term. Everybody wants to be called that. So the Disciples of Christ are the northern faction, the Churches of Christ are the southern faction, and then Christian churches sort of, some people include them, some people don't. Christian churches aren't divided along the same line as the Disciples and the Churches of Christ, but are their own sort of thing. But predominantly it's the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ.
Gotcha. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So James, as you heard, we're talking about the Second Great Awakening. That's not my field of expertise. We did talk about it a little bit last week, and I gave a very rudimentary introduction to it. So maybe you could tell us what it is, why it's significant, when it started, where it started, just some of the background.
Yeah. So where to start and what to say? So a lot of historians and people who write on the Second Great Awakening start at this revival meeting that happens at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and this sort of gets us back to talking about Campbell, because the revival meeting at Cane Ridge was associated with this guy Barton Stone, who, like Campbell, former Presbyterian, was really dissatisfied with hierarchical churches, and so Stone and a bunch of other people put together this. Essentially what's a Lord's Supper celebration, a Presbyterian standard Lord's Supper celebration. And it becomes this massive revival meeting that a lot of historians say kicked off the Second Great Awakening. And Stone's followers eventually merge with Campbell's followers. People who are in the movement, so people who are Church of Christ members or Disciples of Christ members, tend to call this history the history of the Stone-Campbell movement. And that's relatively recent. Stone was sort of marginalized to obscurity for a long time, and then there has been this decades-long effort now to revitalize his legacy. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer. When these two movements merge, Campbell really becomes the dominant force, and Stone is really, in my opinion, resigned to sort of second-tier status. Nevertheless, Cane Ridge, early 19th century, kicks off revivalism again, right? So you all talked about the First Great Awakening already. And so this is a moment where that historians point to say this is the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. Now, the problem with that is, in my opinion anyway, is that both the First and the Second Great Awakening aren't really a thing. And what I mean by that is both the First and the Second Great Awakening are these sort of anachronistic interpretive attempts to make to unify something that wasn't unified. So whether we're talking about the First Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, the thing that has become clear, and I think most historians who study this agree now, that it's episodic, it's not unified, it's local, it's not long lasting, and nevertheless, there are similarities across the country. And so, how do we talk about this thing? Is perhaps the question that comes out of that interpretation. But I tend to agree with John Butler, who wrote the book of Washington Sea of Faith, that whether we're talking about the first or second, what we're really talking about is a bunch of different Christian groups attempting to harness something in similar ways in different places with different results. But that's Cane Ridge is sort of where the Second Great Awakening kicks off. But really, it's a continuation of the first. Maybe I'll stop there, and if there's something I need to clarify, or if there's a question that comes from that, maybe that'll be a good segue into something else.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tyler. Didn't I tell you the First Great Awakening may not have ever even ended? We have another guest here. So anyway, that's great. Thank you. So one question I wanted to ask is totally spaced it now. Why do you think all these, because you mentioned that there's something going on with all of these different groups.
Yeah.
What do you think the catalyst of that was? Why were all these groups doing this at roughly the same time?
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. And I think claiming that the Second Great Awakening wasn't a unified movement begs that question. So I think there are a lot of reasons. So the answer is multifaceted. The short answer, again, appealing to Butler's interpretation of this entire history from the First to the Second Great Awakening, is that particularly in the 19th century, after the American Revolution, and really after the War of 1812, there is this sense of compulsion by Americans to choose correctly. And the reason that he says that compulsion exists is that when the revolution happens, there's an end to order. Right. So order before the revolution was maintained by the British Empire. And after the American Revolution, there's this anxiety about what should society be? What should Christianity be? What should an American Christian be? Right. And so Americans are anxious about the lack of order, the lack of stability in their lives, and so they're searching for order, they're searching for structure, which contrasts the other dominant interpretation at the time, which is Nathan Hatch's democratization of American Christianity, right? Which he says the reason this happens is because of the marketplace of religion. Which absolutely, there's a marketplace of religion where people get to choose, right? But both Butler and then Lincoln Mullen is a history professor at George Mason, and he wrote a dissertation and then a book on this topic. And his argument was that Americans in this time felt compelled to choose, and they felt an internal compulsion. And so my argument, my interpretation, whether that's true or not, I have no idea, right? I can't get inside the people I study. I can't get inside their heads any more than I can get inside yours, right? I only know what's going on in my brain. But when I think about the Second Great Awakening, and I think about compulsion to choose, the thing that has come to dominate my research is that this is the same moment that the United States ends mercantilism as its economic structure and moves into a capitalist economic structure. And what comes along with that is a consumerist society. And a consumerist society compels consumers to choose. And so, when I think about why are all of these different groups attempting to do similar things, the answer that I've come to in my research is that they're attempting to expand market share. They're attempting to harness consumers, to garner consumers. And so that's sort of the short answer to why I think all of these different groups are doing similar things. And that's the material answer. I also think there's a philosophical and a theological and an economic answer that's different, right? So we could talk about Scottish common sense philosophy, and those sorts of things that definitely play a role in thinking about why this happens when it does.
So
Tyler,
this down for me a little bit.
Hold on, Tyler.
Oh,
didn't
ahead,
I say the same thing? I can't get into their heads. I can't get into your head. I said the exact same thing, didn't I?
I already told you, John, I do not listen to the podcast. So whatever you said, just in one ear, out the other.
All right.
I think you did. Yes. Let the record show that John agrees with Dr. James Dupey, who probably taught him not too long ago.
I didn't. I take no credit for John.
So I just wanted to dumb it down a tiny bit for me. You said they transitioned from mercantilism to capitalism. When you say that, mercantilism is when they are there to support the British economy, and capitalism is kind of when they're just supporting their own economy. Is that kind of where you're going with those two terms?
Yeah, sort of. So here's the I think the best way to think about mercantilism and capitalism, the difference between them, right? So, well, maybe two things. Okay, so mercantilism is an idea about wealth that thinks about it as let's think about it as a pie, right? So this is our pie, and a mercantilist framing believe, right? People who are thinking and working along these lines believe that there's only this much wealth available. And so the nation or the kingdom or the empire wants to grab, as I feel that's weird on my mouth, wants to grab as much of that pie as possible, right? But it's limited, right?
Yeah.
A capitalist economic structure says, here's the pie today, but tomorrow the pie could be here, and then 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 here. So under mercantilism, the idea is that all the wealth that exists is limited. It can't grow, it can't shrink. It is what it is, and you want to get as much of it as you can. And that's an oversimplification, but
that's very helpful. I've been hearing and using the term capitalists my entire life, and now I actually know what I was talking about, because I had never thought of it in those terms. So I appreciate it. Well, yeah. I've learned my lesson for the day. You all can go on and figure out the rest. No,
that's where the phrase "get a piece of the pie" comes from.
There you go.
Yeah. And I was also going to say, don't worry about how you look. 2/3 of our listeners are just audio only, so they won't even.
Yes.
Whatever we try to do, they're not going to come back and watch the video after listening audio, no matter how ridiculous we make it sound like it looks.
4 of our 6 listeners do not watch the video. Yeah. So
they're missing out.
Yeah. Thanks. So I'm actually fascinated with what you were saying. You said that you gave that quick answer, but then you also said there's economic, philosophical, theological reasons. And I know we want to touch on a lot of stuff, and we don't have that much time, but could you just say a little bit about the economic reasons, and then the philosophical, and then theological?
Yeah, let me think about the best way to sort of tackle those. So the Second Great Awakening, for lack of a better term, right? We're going to use that term because it's a working term. Inherits the legacy of both the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening, right? And so, and we could get crazy complex with both of those things too. But let's try and be as straightforward as possible. So, the Enlightenment offered this idea that truth was obtainable through rationally and reasonably observing the world and reasoning yourself to first principles, right? That you could that you didn't need revelation, right? That and there were certainly Enlightenment thinkers who believed in revelation, right? So Scottish common sense philosophers, for example, they're the ones who sort of bridge the gap between the Enlightenment and theology. But so the Enlightenment gave philosophy in this moment, right? This idea that you could determine truth through observation. You could determine truth simply by thinking logically, right? So on one side we have what the Enlightenment gives, and perhaps most importantly, the Enlightenment gives social contract theory, right? So particularly Lockean social contract theory, and that's the idea that those who govern rule by the consent of the governed, right? And that matters not only for politics, but it really matters for Christians, right? Because prior to social contract theory, Christians, like political states, are sort of ruled by divine right, right? Thinking that especially if we think about the Catholic Church, right? That God has placed the Pope there, and that what the Pope says is the way things have to be, right? So social contract theory offers this other route, and so the Enlightenment gives that component. The First Great Awakening gives it's sort of the antithesis to the Enlightenment, and not completely, but the First Great Awakening, a major part of it is rejecting the materialism and the rational thinking of the Enlightenment, and saying you aren't a Christian unless you have an individual experience, right? So it's an experiential relationship with the divine. Now, the Second Great Awakening, especially for Campbellites, who I study, is a combination of those two things. And so from the Enlightenment, the Second Great Awakening takes rational thinking, and from the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening takes individualism, right? So there are a whole host of people in the Second Great Awakening who embrace the experiential relationship with the divine, but the people that I study don't. In fact, they're very anti-revival. They're very anti-emotional response, but they're all about individualism, at least rhetorically, right? So the First Great Awakening gives the rhetoric of individualism, and the Enlightenment gives the rhetoric of social contract theory, of upending authority and saying you're not going to be in charge anymore because it doesn't make sense that you're in charge, and so this is our new structure, right? So those two things contribute significantly to the Second Great Awakening. And then to tie in the economic component, when mercantilism ends and capitalism is sort of in its nascent form in the early republic, one of the things that happens across industries is a move from selling to concrete local markets to selling in the abstract marketplace. And we see the same thing in religion. So I write about Campbell doing this, but he's certainly not the only one. I just think he's one of the best examples, right? He goes from being a local preacher, so that's a concrete market, to being a preacher, entrepreneur, editor, shipping his magazine across the country, across the Atlantic, and reaching an abstract audience, people who he will never meet, but is effectively selling them on his prescription for Christianity, as well as actually selling them material goods, right? So I don't know if that sort of answers or frames in the question well, but theology, philosophy, and economy, sort of those are the three ways that I see them contributing to the Second Great Awakening.
No, that's awesome. Thanks.
When did Campbell publish that?
So Campbell starts his first magazine in 1823.
Okay.
And it's called the Christian Baptist. And Campbell was a brilliant marketer. So he was loosely affiliated with the Baptists, really as sort of an insurgent. And so for 7 years, he publishes this magazine called the Christian Baptist, all the while undermining Baptist authority and leadership. And then in 1830, he launches a new magazine after a internationally recognized debate with Robert Owen, who was a socialist utopian reformer that Campbell sort of finagled into debating him in Cincinnati. But then Campbell launches this new magazine, and this new magazine is called the Millennial Harbinger. And it's a way of distancing himself from the Baptists because he's essentially already taken everyone from Baptist congregational roles that he's going to. So 1830 is a jumping off point for him. Launches the Millennial Harbinger, and that one runs past his death. So he dies just after the Civil War in 1866. It runs for 4 more years after his death, but it's one of the longest running Christian periodicals in the 19th century. Thousands of readers. It makes him fantastically wealthy. It's a remarkable entrepreneurial moment in religious print.
Awesome, thank you. Where was Campbell based? Actually,
So this will take us back to Mormon history.
Mm-hmm.
So both Joseph Smith and Campbell are in the Ohio River Valley. So they're competing for the same people. In fact, Sidney Rigdon was a Campbellite before he was a Mormon.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
right.
Sidney Rigdon was a prominent Campbellite. I mean, one of the most effective evangelists for disciples of Christ, Christians only, whatever we want to call them. And then when he converts to Mormonism, I mean, it's scandalous, and he takes his people with him. But so the reason I tell that story is Sidney Rigdon, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting characters in the Second Great Awakening, because he's a prominent member of the 2 American-born denominations, or the 2 most prominent American-born denominations, and and that's interesting. And I think his history as a Mormon is far more interesting than his history as a Campbellite, because it was so short-lived.
Yeah.
But so Campbell is operating in the same space as Joseph Smith. In fact, Campbell's one of the first people to publish a review of the Book of Mormon, which of course is scathing. Publishes it, I want to say, within months of the Book of Mormon being published. So he's well aware of Smith. How aware Smith is of Campbell, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure either. Well, that's cool.
How similar were their teachings between Joseph Smith and Campbell?
I mean, within the Christian purview, they almost couldn't be more opposite.
Okay.
So they're both restorationists, right? So they're both making this claim for restoring the ancient faith, but they do it in polar opposite ways. So Campbell opposed the idea that anyone could have a new revelation. So Campbell didn't have a new revelation. Campbell didn't think anyone could have a new revelation. What Campbell thought was, which is consistent with Scottish common sense philosophy, was that if a rational person read the Bible in a vernacular translation, they would come to the same conclusion as him, which is, baptism is only for adults. I mean, we could do I could break down his Christian beliefs, but effectively it's pretty conventional Protestant Christianity, but opposed to workings of the Spirit. So he that's why I say they hated revivalism, because they didn't like emotional religiosity. Opposed to infant baptism. They thought that baptism ought to be, not only ought to be, but was ordained, was divined to be for consenting adults who had thought about it logically and come to the conclusion that they needed salvation through baptism. But otherwise, relatively conventional Christian who makes this claim that he wants to restore the ancient faith by returning to first century Christianity and the Word. So he's all about the Word. He's all about sola scriptura, coming to the Bible and the Bible alone. So no clergy, no hierarchy. It's you and God, you and the Bible. At least rhetorically, that's not how it functioned. But rhetorically, that's what he said. Whereas Smith, one of the things I love about Mormon history that I don't think gets enough attention is how radical it is. Smith is a radical, and it, it changes depending on which era, which moment of his life we're talking about. But Smith is not conventional in most ways, except the one that I started with, which is the way he thought about sacred space. That was relatively conventional, but outside of thinking about sacred space, he's not conventional, and not very American. In fact, one of the reasons Mormons are frequently, what's the word I'm looking for? Discriminated against is because Smith is so unconventional and so quote unquote un-American, right? I mean, he's basically a socialist, and in a nascent capitalist nation, to suggest that all property should be held by a community is scandalous. Mormons vote as a bloc, right? So very anti-democratic, and a whole host of other things. Didn't believe in the separation of church and state. Fundamentally believed that the state ought to be divine, right? Which a lot of other people believe, but not with the conviction that Smith did. So very different religious figures. And I haven't studied I intend to, but I haven't studied the sort of business model of early Mormon history. But it's different than Campbell's. So Campbell's business model is a consumerist approach to garnering both followers and subscribers. Smith's isn't. It sort of meets the same need for early Americans. So, one of the things we see in both movements are people who are looking for stability. And so people who sort of feel lost, feel the tumult of the time, feel like early America is chaotic and they're looking for a place not only where they belong, but where they'll find opportunity. Those people find a home both in Campbellite groups and in Mormon groups. And so in terms of the end goal, I think it's the same, but the approach to convincing people to join is just so remarkably different, which I find really interesting.
It's funny how radical ideas seem so unradical when you learn them as a child and carry them through your lives.
Yeah. Interestingly though, and maybe you two have thoughts on this. Mormon history to me is a history of the success of the American nation state in my mind, because if we look at Nauvoo, what happens in Nauvoo, which is the culmination of getting kicked out of other places effectively, right? If we look at what happens there, you have this very clear judgment by American society that Mormons are not what it means to be American, right? And similarly, I think the Mormon community determines that they agree that that they're not what it means to be American. In fact, the American project has failed in their mind, right? It's a sinful project and will meet its demise. And so that they go to Utah. But if we look at Mormon history up through today, right, one of the successes of the American project is that when we look at the average Mormon today, they look a lot like most other Protestant denominations. They vote similarly. They're fully embedded in capitalism, both culturally and economically. And so, Ben Park was here last year, and this is one of the things that I pushed him on with his book Kingdom of Nauvoo. He looks at that history as an indictment of the failure of the American system. And one of the questions I had was, if we agree, which he and I do, if we agree that the project of the American state is to secure democracy and to base everything that happens on the perpetual expansion of the economy through capitalism, right? Wouldn't we see the expulsion of these people as a success of the nation state, not as an indictment of its failure? This is a success. This is the nation state saying this is not what it means to be an American, right? Which I think he rightly looks at other groups, right? So the Cherokee tried desperately to be American, right? They write their own constitution. They embrace race-based slavery. They want to say, we're like you. We're a sovereign people. We do the same things you do. We're civilized in the way that you are. And it doesn't matter, right? And it doesn't matter for different reasons than for Mormons. But expelling Mormons is a success of the nation state, which isn't, I don't use that word as like, it's a positive, right? But it's a fulfillment of the national goals of the United States, right? But the interesting thing is that I think now the Mormon Church looks very differently in its relationship to the nation state than it did in, say, 1850, right? Or pick something between 1840 and 1896, I want to say.
Yep.
Yeah.
When statehood came about.
Yeah.
Utah statehood. Yep. Yeah, it is interesting because it's just like you said, they try the very traditional, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but they go they try the correct routes, I guess. Like they appeal to their senators, their representatives. They even go to the White House and ask for help. And nothing really comes of that except they get to expand, the American footprint, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
So interesting stuff. There's kind of a funny quote. There was a group of Mormons that began sailing. You might know about this, but there was a group of them that sailed from New York down around South America up to California, because the idea was, instead of going on the overland trail, they were going to sail around. Maybe that was easier. And during the time that they did that, the United States won the American-Mexican War, the U.S.-Mexican War, and so California raises the American flag. They get to California and it's like, and one of them says, "There's that damn flag again." It's kind of a famous historical quote, but there's a lot of irony going on there. It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are tensions. There are tensions, and there's cognitive dissonance, or at least what looks like cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Right? When you look at, especially looking at Nauvoo, when you as you mentioned, sending people to Congress, sending people to talk to the president, right? And at the same time saying we're not bound by these laws, right? We're sovereign. Yeah. We're not bound by these laws. I mean, Joseph Smith avoids prosecution by undermining habeas corpus, right? It's multiple times, which is just fascinating. But yeah, I find Joseph Smith to be a very interesting radical in ways that I don't think gets enough attention by people who study American religious history.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because I think during the 20th century, in an effort to seem more American, you see the Mormonism kind of try to tamper that radicalism down.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering too, because Joseph Smith was definitely a radical, but were there other radical figures during the Second Great Awakening that you
Oh,
know about?
absolutely. I mean, if you think about William Miller, right, who started the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but like Smith, a man of his time, making all sorts of predictions and then revising them when they don't happen. Right. So, one of the intellectual movements that's happening in this period is millennialism, right? So thinking about the second coming of Jesus, when it's going to happen, right? Are we amillennialist? Are we post-millennialist? Are we neither? And so you have William Miller and the Adventists, you have the Shakers, which, even from the sheer standpoint of numerical success, right? Their idea from the very beginning is going to be a failure because they are strictly celibate, right? So they can't reproduce their population. So yeah, I mean, you have the Shakers, you have the Millerites, you have utopian reformers like Robert Owen, and I actually think that Smith probably ought to be classified as a utopian reformer more than he should be maybe necessarily classified as a restorationist, because I think what he was trying to do in Nauvoo is really similar to utopian reformers. And it's really remarkable. And it's not only remarkable in like a socialist vis-a-vis capitalist sort of way, but it's remarkable in a humanist sort of way, right? So you have this period of American history that people felt the anxiety of the moment, and Smith got this, right? He grew up in a family in New York that wasn't economically stable, and so he creates this system that is supported by a theology that says we are going to hold all things in common, and I find that really remarkable. Interestingly, though, it's consistent with a lot of what's in New Testament writings, right? So first century Christ followers, and in the Old Testament, right? So it's consistent with both of those historical and intellectual and theological threads. But when we look at the Second Great Awakening, it's radical. There are very few people who are reforming Christianity or restoring Christianity who are saying we should hold all things in common. It's just remarkable.
Yeah. Talk about that millennialist idea. You mentioned, I think you said amillennial, which I think means premillennialist, and postmillennialist, right?
So
amillennialists
don't believe in the millennium at all.
Right. Okay.
So it's about Jesus's 1,000-year reign, right? So it comes from the book of Revelation, and it's the belief that either there is going to be a period of horrors, and then Christ will return and there's a 1,000-year reign on earth, or the other. So Christ will return, and then when Christ leaves, it's chaos and disaster, and right. So, but the basic point is millennial thinking is about Christ's return, and it sweeps the nation, and it makes a difference in who people associate or who people align themselves with, what people are thinking. This is the thinking that Pentecostalism embraces and grows out of, very sort of metaphysical, active spirit sort of theology.
Yeah. Okay.
I've heard the idea thrown out there, and I don't recall when or where, or even the context, but that most religions have some sort of underlying end is near theme to it. Would that be true across this time period, across basically all the religions, and maybe all religions across all time periods?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a good question, and it makes me think of both Campbell and Smith. So this helps me get back on track. So Campbell Campbell wasn't a millennialist in the way that a lot of others were, but he certainly saw the United States in particular as um, God ordained and as the next step in a progressive line toward heaven on earth, toward utopia, toward a global Christian brotherhood. So he believed that democracy and capitalism, although he wouldn't have articulated it as capitalism, but um, this idea that people were rational, and if you gave them the opportunity, they would choose correctly. He thought that the United States was that God had planned to use the United States to usher in this new kingdom. Similarly, Smith saw America as the next chosen, right? So America was supposed to be the next Israel, right? The chosen ones, which we see that today, right? There are a lot of Protestant Christians who see America as God's chosen nation. And that's very true in the early 19th century. And it ties into millennialist thinking and assuming that Christ's return was near, which, isn't new in Christian history, right? I mean, that's in the first century. The assumption was that any day Christ would return.
Yeah, sort of a defining characteristic in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. So I also wanted to ask you about revivals. Like, how would you define revivals? Was that a major characteristic of the Second Great Awakening? What part did they have to play in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a major characteristic of the Second Great Awakening. But I think they get a lot more attention than they deserve. And the reason for that is, so whether we're talking about Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, which those are the three main groups that use revivals, right, they're really ineffective. In fact, frequently they worked to garner followers to other denominations. And even when they did work, a lot of times it was short-lived. So, you'd get passionate congregants or adherents or whatever you want to call them, that were ephemeral. They're there for a little bit and then they're gone. So I think revivals get more attention than they deserve because they're sort of like, they're interesting and they're weird, and you get all these stories about how insane they were. Thousands of people showing up to Cane Ridge, thousands of people showing up to a Methodist camp meeting in Western Kentucky. So revivals play a role. They play a significant role, but I think they play a less important role than institutionalization. So when we look at the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians maybe less so, but certainly the Baptists and the Methodists, especially the Methodists, right? Francis Asbury has no interest in egalitarian religiosity, no interest in democratic governance. It's very top down, and institutionalizing the successes of revivals allows Methodism to grow exponentially and become the largest denomination in the United States in the 19th century. And institutionalization is kind of boring, and so it doesn't get the attention that revivals do. Those groups that are able to take spectacle and turn it into congregants and keep them are the ones that succeed. And so the Methodists are a good example of that. The Baptists really do a better job of that. Do a better job in the First Great Awakening of garnering supporters. In the Second Great Awakening, and I'd have to look at numbers to be sure. But in the Second Great Awakening, I think that they're less successful, even though they grow.
Yeah.
And they grow significantly. But I think the First Great Awakening, they were sort of insurgents, and in the Second Great Awakening, they're already established. But when we look at Campbellites, that's exactly what we see. So Campbell creates spectacle, not through revivals because he hates them, but through widely publicized debates, widely publicized preaching tours. Debates were like, maybe like the Super Bowl, right? I mean,
right.
When Campbell debates Owen, thousands of people come. I mean, so many people come that it lasts forever. When Campbell debated Reverend Walker in Kentucky, they had to move from the church building where they were planning to have the debate to the Methodist meeting grounds, the revival grounds, because so many people came, hundreds of miles, thousands of people. So what Campbell was really good at was taking spectacle and then turning it into followers, turning it into subscribers. So it's for him, it's a marketing tour. It's P&R PR. It's PR.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he institutionalized. So in the early days, Campbell was opposed to clergy being paid. If you were a preacher, you should do it for free because that's what God calls you to do. But then as he garners tens of thousands of followers and the movement begins to grow, he begins to realize we need some paid staff. We need some people to harness, all of these followers. And so he institutionalizes, he supports paid clergy. He starts Bethany College, which still exists to this day. Translates a version of the Bible, has a denominational hymn book, all of the things that you do when you're going from being an insurgent to being an institution. And that's the part of the Second Great Awakening that doesn't get the attention that it probably deserves because it's just not as interesting.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Tyler.
I'm starting to learn from what you said last week and what James is sharing with us today, that a revival is nothing what I had envisioned. I envisioned almost like a 30, 45-minute sermon under a tarp with 20 to 40 people listening. It's sounding like they're almost, I don't want to call it, what's it called? Fireman? No, Burning Man, where people travel and stay days, and there's thousands of people there, and there's maybe one preacher, I guess. But it seems much more of a destination rather than just a Sunday afternoon lecture.
Yeah, I think Burning Man is an interesting and in some ways apt comparison. I'm old enough that I think of like the Warped Tour, the Vans Warped Tour.
Oh yeah.
You've got multiple stages and tens of thousands of people. Yeah, these revivals were wild. I mean, and that's one of the reasons more conservative religious folks thought this isn't Christianity. This is obscene. It's wild. This isn't what Christianity is supposed to be. And so, in the First Great Awakening, that's a big deal. In the Second Great Awakening, perhaps less so, but still, there are a lot of people who think revivals are, and Campbell included, revivals are these crazy, uncontrolled, emotional moments that don't get at authentic religiosity, though others would say this is the only authentic religiosity.
So at a revival, is it several preachers traveling together and they might debate? I mean, you mentioned debates where they might be kind of preaching side by side and maybe responding to each other as they're giving a sermon, or are they more individual?
Yeah, so revivals tended to be planned collaboratively, but usually by a group.
Okay.
So, Cane Ridge is a good example. There are sort of different interests at Cane Ridge, but for the most part, it's Presbyterians or Seceder Presbyterians or people who used to be Presbyterians and now are sort of unaffiliated, but it's still a Presbyterian meeting. And there are multiple people who speak, whereas debates, particularly religious debates, tended to pit denominations against each other. So Campbell, his first two most prominent debates were against Presbyterians, which is the denomination he'd come from. Then he debated Robert Owen, socialist utopian reformer, but then he debated Bishop Purcell, so a Catholic, prominent American Catholic in Cincinnati. And so debates were a different kind of spectacle than revivals that hoped to win converts from the other side, and similarly weren't effective at doing that. And in Campbell's case, the benefit really was from popularizing the published edition of his debates. So he would have copyright rights to the published debate that would be agreed upon in advance, and then would sell the published copy of the debate. And that usually was far more important than the debate itself.
Yeah, I'm sure most Mormon missionaries can attest how much fun debating is, and also how unproductive it is at the same time. Yeah. So if James, if you and John ever want to have a debate, I will be happy to moderate. Just tell me when and I'll be there.
That would be fun.
James wins. But it's interesting that you mentioned that revivals are actually overblown a little bit. And I remember when I was at Arizona State with you, talking a little bit about sort of the democratization, and you mentioned Hatch's book already. Yeah. But I've never actually thought about the institutionalization and how heavy that became, because you look at some of you're right, the more successful movements out of that era are pretty heavily institutionalized. Like Mormon Church is a huge institution. But maybe you could say a little bit more about that, because I get the sense that the Second Great Awakening was influential in spreading this democratization, right? Spreading democracy in a way, because you had these itinerant preachers riding around in the woods to these small villages, kind of spreading the word. You didn't really need educational authority to be a preacher or to lead a congregation. But as you said, with the increase in institutionalization, that doesn't really seem to be the case. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So Nathan Hatch and John Butler continue to dominate this field, and they have opposing interpretations. And so Butler is all about order, that Americans are searching for order. Hatch is all about democratization, that this marketplace of Christianity created a competitive marketplace where Americans got to choose, right? So it was democratic. Individuals got to choose. And I tend to agree with Butler, but I phrase it differently. I think when we look at the Second Great Awakening, and I've touched on this a little bit already, what we're looking at is the emergence of a consumerist Christianity. And consumerism imitates democracy, even while it undercuts it, right? So I like to compare consumerism to a shell game, right? So the person playing the shell game feels the power of choosing, feels compelled to choose, because they have to pick one of the shells with the ball under it. But the power is in the person who holds the shells, right? The power is in the person, if we're talking about the Second Great Awakening, is with the people who have the capital. And so it feels democratic because you get to choose. But beyond that power, beyond the power of that choice, what happens in the Second Great Awakening isn't very democratizing, in my opinion, because what follows that choice is a submission to the institution. Now, I think there's a good argument for saying that it's more democratic than in earlier eras of Christianity. But even Hatch's book, right? So the fact that Hatch uses Joseph Smith in Mormon history as one of his cases for democratization, to me, is absurd. Similarly with Campbell, and Campbell,
Mhm.
you know, it's a little more slippery than it is with Smith. But even with Campbell, Campbell is often called, so, you know, there is no hierarchy in Campbellite churches, but Campbell is often called the bishop of the disciples of Christ, even though he would have hated that, right? He would have said, "I absolutely not. I'm the same as everyone else." But he wasn't. He had control. He had power that the average person in a congregation, you know, I don't know, Bethany, West Virginia, for that matter, didn't have. And so there's a real difference between a consumerist Christianity and a democratized Christianity. And what I see is a consumerist Christianity that imitates democracy because consumers have a choice. But like I said at the beginning, Lincoln Mullen's book, they feel compelled to choose, right? They feel like they have to choose. And similar or relatedly, people like Campbell pump tons of capital into compelling them to choose correctly. And if you don't have the capital, you lose. So maybe I'll end with this on this question. When I first started this research, I was interested in ideas, and I was curious about why one religious leader was successful and another one wasn't. And I thought it had to be about this one had better ideas than this one.
Yeah.
But the more I got into the sources, the more I realized this one had more capital, and this one didn't. And the one with more capital is predictive. And so when I look at the Second Great Awakening, what I see is a consumerist Christianity where those with capital usually succeed, those without capital usually fail. And that's the best explanation I have for why the Second Great Awakening has the contours that it does, which also isn't as fun as revivalism.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Like, we need to have you back, I think. So, because you just opened up a whole lot of questions. Like, for example, like what kind of capital did Joseph Smith have, and that, and also I think you hit on it too, where it kind of forced people into making a choice, and maybe a sort of a microcosm of that, or a tiny, whatever they're called, you know, a tiny example of that would be in Joseph Smith's own history, where he agonizes over what church to join, you know, early on. But anyway, thanks so much for taking the time. I do want to give you a kind of a plug because I'm curious too. But are you publishing anything right now? Do you have any books that you're working on? What are you working on right now that we can look forward to?
Yeah, so I've got an article that's under revisions, and so hopefully that'll go back to the editor this month. Awesome. And then my goal is to and you know, I never hit these goals, but my goal is to have the book manuscript done by the end of the year. So,
and is this on the consumer or the capitalism in early American religion?
Awesome. Yeah, so this will be on consumerist Christianity, looking at how religious entrepreneurs marketed themselves, how they manufactured demand. You know, that capitalism isn't simply supply and demand. Demand is often manufactured, and then a product meets that manufactured demand. All those sorts of things.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much. Tyler, do you have anything else?
No, thank you so much, James. I appreciate it. That was awesome. And I agree with John. I hope that we get a chance to do this again.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was a lot of fun. I was thrilled to do it, and hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
It was awesome.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
No, not at all.
And hopefully we can convince all 6 of our listeners to read your article once it comes out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are you publishing it? What journal?
Well, I'm not going to say, because if they reject it, I'm going to publish it somewhere else.
Okay. Well, come back when you know, and then we will spread the word.
Yeah. So they sent it back to me and said, we want to publish this, but you got to make these changes. And the challenge is some of the changes I don't want to make because I don't agree with them. So we'll see what they do. But if it gets published with who I hope it gets published with, which is the current journal that I'm working with, I'll let you know.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
We'll see you.
Yeah.
That was awesome, John. That was great.
Yeah,
I didn't even get halfway through my Bob Ross positive energy drink. I was gonna my positive energy drink. I got this because I thought it was gonna be a long night out here, but that just flew right by. That was great.
Yeah.
And I feel awful that I called him by your name and not his own name. I'm never gonna live that one down.
Yeah, you should be. But yeah, I think we need to get more guests. So I'll work on that.
Okay. We're still going, right?
Yeah. I figured we need to wrap it up.
We haven't done the song yet.
Yeah, we need to do the song, and we also need to tell our listeners, leave a review. And you can find us wherever fine podcasts are sold.
And subscribe on YouTube. Go YouTube.
Yeah, leave comments. We got our first didn't we get our first comment on YouTube last time?
We got our first comment from someone I did not know. We have a couple comments out there from the person you call Mrs. Jones and the person I call your sister. But this was our first one. It was actually a good one. We should talk about that a little bit. I wish I had it up to read, but they said I had some, and they put in quotations, alone time with my wife, and we listened to the introductory song of your podcast, and I can honestly say that it saved our marriage. So we are making a difference, one horrific trombone solo at a time.
Yep.
So, check out that review if you don't believe me, which you probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else, John?
Nope.
I sure hope that team. I'm going to check the score now because this is pre-recorded. I sure hope my team. Oh, good, my team's winning the Super Bowl. How about that?
Yeah, go team.
I'm so glad they won. All right. Well, life's rough and roll on. We'll see you, John.
Bye, Tyler.
Do I need to mute you? I'm trying to enjoy this.
Oh, I'm enjoying it.
We probably saved like 4 marriages right here.
Yep. I have to think most long times last about as long as the song does.
I love saving marriages. We'll see y'all.